Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Let's begin tonight amidst a national conversation about reopening with two principles I think everyone can agree on across the political spectrum. The first principle is that total shelter-in-place lockdown is not a sustainable, open-ended way to run American society. For any number of reasons, there is only so long we can do this. I say that as a journalist who's in contact all day, every day with many sources, and also as a parent with school-age children who has been trying, along with my wife, to homeschool them every day. The current status quo cannot exist forever, okay? I think we agree on that. That's principle one. Principle two is we're not going back to the pre-coronavirus normal anytime soon. Huge parties with thousands of people packed into a frat house on a college campus, or crowded rock concerts in giant arenas, sold out Broadway shows, football stadiums filled with 100,000 people just packed next to each other. I think it's pretty unlikely any of those things are going to look how they looked before. We're going to stand further away from each other. We're not going to crowd into spaces. We're going to wear masks. Workplaces that can do it are going to have different people in on different shifts and try to stay basically as empty as possible so everyone's not sitting in the same bullpen breathing each other's air. And that, principle two, that we're not going back to normal, that is something even acknowledged by people on the leading edge of opening up. Even in places like Texas, where restaurants will open on Friday, those restaurants are only allowed to have 25% capacity. In Georgia, right? Georgia famously the most sort of out front on this. Some barbers are only allowing one customer in the store at a time. Others wait outside 6 feet apart. So most people, well, I would say almost everyone, understands that things need to change. So those are the two principles we all seem to agree on. And the question is, what is in between those two principles, right? What is a safe, responsible way of reopening? What we like to call on this show door number three. Right? The option that is neither an uncontrolled, horrific pandemic or an economic depression. And I got to say, this should not be some weird culture war question, despite the effort of some to make it one in order to detract from the manifest failures of the president or to march people out to sacrifice themselves to the Dow. It is a difficult, complicated question that the world, every world leader, every state in the union is dealing with. And there's actually a specific goal every society is trying to accomplish, and that is this: to keep the rate of transmission of the coronavirus down so that each infected person infects, on average, less than one other person. Okay, this is the key benchmark. If the transmission rate is less than 1, the disease is declining. If the transmission rate is more than 1, the disease is spreading. That is literally the threshold to create a society and an economy that are working. German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who happens to be a doctor of quantum chemistry, explained just 2 weeks ago as that country was gearing up to reopen parts of its economy.
Und wir haben Modellbetrachtungen gemacht. Wir sind jetzt ungefähr bei diesem Reproduktionsfaktor 1, also einer steckt einen an, der natürlich auch nicht, das kann ich immer nur für eine Infektionskette sagen, ob einer einen ansteckt, das ist dann ein Mittelwert, aber es ist ungefähr einer steckt einen an. Schon wenn wir darauf kommen, dass jeder 1,1 Menschen ansteckt, dann sind wir im Oktober wieder an der Leistungsfähigkeit unseres Gesundheitssystems mit den angenommenen Intensivbetten. Wenn wir 1,2, also jeder steckt 20% mehr, 1,2 an, also von 5 Menschen steckt einer 2 an und 4 ein. Dann kommen wir im Juli schon an die Belastungsgrenze unseres Gesundheitssystems und bei 1,3, das hört sich nicht viel, wir kommen von 4, 5 Ansteckungen, 3 bis 5 Ansteckungen. 1,3 sind wir im Juni an der Belastungsgrenze unseres Gesundheitssystems. Daran sehen Sie also, in welch kleinem Spielraum wir uns aufhalten.
So, first of all, just imagine for a second having a leader that thought of the question of how to reopen society with that level of nuance. But that's what's necessary. So when Germany started to open up, they had the infection transmission rate down to 0.8, right below that 1 threshold. But the coronavirus started creeping back up to an infection rate of 1 because this virus is so contagious. So few people have immunity. In Singapore, which we have covered on this show, many have covered as a success story because it has been, they are now dealing there with a second outbreak, which is essentially forcing them to enter back into shelter in place. And the reason is because they ignored a marginal community, migrant workers who live packed in dormitories on the outskirts of the city. But the margins don't stay the margins for long with this virus. Other places like Taiwan and South Korea have been able to keep the virus suppressed. They've been going through door number 3 through lots of testing and contact tracing. Our own American city, Seattle, one of the first places near an outbreak with its huge shelter-in-place order. They moved early. They have gotten their infection rate down to where they started to lift some restrictions on things like farmers markets, outdoors, people can buy food. That is what is so important about what Angela Merkel was saying. The margin of error is so small because of the way exponential growth works, what we have seen happen, right? You can find yourself back where we were 2 months ago, February 29th, when there was literally one confirmed death, before it spins out of control and we lose 60,000 lives in 60 days. And there are so many deaths that one funeral home is moving bodies in U-Haul trucks because they don't have enough room. The question of how and when to reopen society is a hard problem to solve, but a worst-case scenario would be after we have lost many tens of thousands of lives and knowingly pushed our economy to the brink of a depression and seen the sacrifice, that the unbelievable national sacrifice Americans have made in so many ways, after we've done all that, to squander all that on some blind hope and culture war propaganda and end up right back in the same place a few months from now.